So I'm very glad to have this opportunity to present on both a film that I like and the field in which I'm currently doing a PhD. So I'm also very much appreciate the opportunity because it's a chance to get some of my own thoughts together, because you often think to yourself, how would I explain my field to people who may not have seen much of it before? So really sort of it's great just to do as an exercise. Now the film The Godfather, if anything, you come to it with some trepidation because it was such a famous film that it's been parodied hundreds of times, many of them on The Simpsons alone. So we've all probably heard all these lines like, make him an offer he cannot refuse, or things like this. And in many ways we sort of lose track of the fact that it's not really a sort of a camped up gangster movie. It was quite a serious film. And if you ever have the chance to see it on the big screen, you really have to see it there, because so much of it is in dialogue and personalities and just even people's expressions. It's a real film about actors and so on. I mean, there's action as well and some violence and so on, but really much less than you'd expect in a film about gangsters. Now I'm going to see if this Apple remote control. Hey! So in my presentation, I'll first say a little bit about the film, then I'll try and say something about what's politics, and then try and say why this is the idea of what international politics will be. And then I'll finish up with a little bit about theories and practice and so on. So, as you see, there'll be four parts, so hopefully you know where we're at in the presentation. So, as for the film itself. So, one of the things to think about the film is that it was a period where there was a great deal of creativity in Hollywood. It was the early 1970s, and directors like Francis Ford Coppola were given much freer rein than they ever had before or since. So they could really make very artistic projects. And so if you ever have an interest in film, the early 70s was a fascinating time known as the New Hollywood. We have sort of controversial films like Taxi Driver, or Bonnie and Clyde, or Apocalypse Now, or The Graduate. And they really sort of raised so many more questions about society and about film and about art than a lot of films ever since. So this is from 1972, and there's like a huge difference between, say, when you watch a film from the early 70s or a film from the late 70s like Star Wars. Because in the late 70s, people suddenly realized, we can make money out of films. And pretty much after Jaws and Star Wars, by the 80s, it was straight back into sort of action films and big blockbusters, and it was commercialized. And back to pretty much what we expect from Hollywood nowadays. So that little period in the early 70s was very artistic. So the actors here, Marlon Brando, he plays a role which nobody ever expected him to play. He was almost unrecognizable when people saw early reels of the film. The studio executives thought, is that Brando? Because Brando had made his name in the 40s and 50s as a really masculine kind of, very glamorous actor. He really sort of burst onto the screen in his films like A Streetcar Named Desire, where he was sort of a really rugged, working class, sort of very sort of athletic looking guy. But then by the 70s, he got old and gained all this weight, and people thought he was all washed up. And then he appeared in this film, and nobody knew what to do. And then Al Pacino, of course, we all know quite well. But it was his first outing in a film. Basically, he swept the Oscars in 72. And the major Oscars, like Best Picture, because it was such a serious film. So, this is what the director called it. He was actually trying to explain to the studio, no, it's not just another gangster film. It's this family movie and a metaphor. Initially, the producer's response involved a large number of F words. So, what was this Steve coming up with? But he was sort of talked around and later thought it was his best idea ever to give the green light to this movie getting made. But you can see he basically had a very serious intent in the film. So here we are. This is just a few of the cast. So Marlon Brando at the top as Don Corleone. He's the head of the leading crime family. Then Al Pacino is his son, but a son who's not involved in the criminal family. He's actually gone to college, and he's gone into the armed forces during the war. And he basically starts the film. He wants nothing to do with their criminal sort of background. And then there's his fiancée Kay, who is she's sort of an Anglo-Saxon American, and she's sort of the outsider in here, but is the major sort of female part. And then you have James Caan, who was also a big actor in the 70s, as Sonny, who's the older son and the heir to Don Corleone. But he's sort of this really aggressive, sort of, no holds barred, sort of rather reckless kind of gangster sort of figure. And then finally, Tom Hagen is the sort of adopted brother who's kind of the advisor to the head of the family. And one of the things about the head of the family is that they have this sort of Sicilian title of Don. But in the movie, they only ever actually call him the Godfather when they're talking about his role as the Godfather of the family, or he's the Godfather of people's children, and things like this. So it's actually from this movie that you get this term that a Godfather is the head of a crime family. It had never been used before. Sort of the film became such kind of culture that we actually got the word, mafia Godfather, which they never used in this film. But the main thing is that, so basically, those two last people, we'll see a bit later, one of them is the aggressive sort of crime type family member, and the last one, Tom, as a sort of very rational and very sensible sort of business-like advisor to the family. And also you'll note that the gender balance in this slide is actually more favourable in the film overall, because there are very few female parts relative to all the many male parts. But and there's a lot of sort of criticism about this, but also the film is it is a study of this sort of very masculine-dominated culture, and in terms of the way Michael, Al Pacino's character, develops from having nothing to do with the crime family to becoming part of it, is really intended to be a kind of a study of masculinity. So a lot of those issues do come up all through the whole film. Now we have, we'll see if the effects will work. This is one of the early scenes. Michael has come back from the war. He's at his sister's wedding, and he's explaining the family business to Kay, who's not familiar with the particular nature of the family business.
When Johnny was first starting out, he signed his personal service contract with a big band here. And as his career got better and better, he wanted to get out of it. Now, Johnny is my father's godson, and my father went to see this man. They offered him $10,000 to let Johnny go. The band said no. So the next day, my father went to see him, and this time Luca brought him. Within an hour, he signed a release for a certified check of $1,000.
How did you do that?
My father made him an offer he couldn't refuse.
What was that?
Luca Brasi held a gun to his head, and my father assured him that either his brains or his signature would be on the contract. That's my family, kid. Not me.
Yes, so this is some idea of the way the family works. But Michael has nothing to do with it. The singer, by the way, was considered to be remarkably similar to Frank Sinatra in his career. So anyway, so now we've got politics, and so broadly speaking, politics I want to talk about is the study of power and the sort of formation of the political order. So I'll give another sort of clip, which is to try to give an idea of where you might see an idea of order and justice forming in a society. So in this clip, a man has come to see the Godfather, Don Corleone, because his daughter has been horribly assaulted, but the men who did this to the daughter, more or less, been let off by the courts. So he comes to the Godfather for a
I went to the police like a good American. These two boys were brought to trial. The judge sentenced them to 3 years in prison and suspended the sentence. Suspended the sentence? They went free that very day. I stood in the courtroom like a fool. And those two bastards, they smiled at me. Then I said to my wife, "For justice, we must go to Don Corleone."
Why did you go to the police? Why didn't you come to me first?
What do you want? Tell me anything. What you were begging me.
What is that? All right, come on, go.
I'll give you anything you ask.
We've known each other many years, but this is the first time you ever came to the council of the house. I can't remember the last time you invited me to your house for a cup of coffee. Even though my wife was godmother to your only child. But let's be frank here. You never wanted that friendship. And you were afraid to be my dad.
I didn't want to get into trouble.
I understand. You found paradise in America. Had a good trade, made a good living, police protected you, and there were courts of law. So you didn't need a family. But now you come to me to say, Don Corleone, give me justice.
Yes, this is the sort of theme which gave me the idea that a good film illustrates the field of international politics, because it's given the idea that there are people who aren't receiving from the state the things which the state is supposed to do, like provide courts and justice and order. So this mafia family provides those services to people who are in their debt. So it's a way that the mafia family is like a state, to provide sort of order and stability and justice, which are the things that you want a government to do. So, because otherwise, you end up in a situation that Hobbes described in the 17th century, which was that without order, man was forced to live in a state of nature. And in a state of nature, your life is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short, which originally I thought was the name of Herman Floyd. And Hobbes was writing that at the end of a period in Europe called the 30 Years' War. The 30 Years' War was the worst war in Europe before the First World War. So 8 million people were killed. The population of Germany was reduced by up to 40%. Whole areas of Europe were completely depopulated. And there was a belief that the state would be the way that you could receive the order that you needed in which people could survive and build a society. So, one of the things which came out of the 30 Years' War was the Peace of Westphalia, which basically consolidated the idea of states. And they had things like sovereignty, and a state would have authority over its territory, and that would be the order in which it would build society. And the state would have all power within its borders. This replaces the previous system, the feudal system, all these things. And the state would be all powerful, and so Hobbes wanted to refer to the most powerful thing on earth. So he referred to the Bible, and he looked for the most powerful thing in the Bible is the Leviathan. So this was the frontispiece to his book in 1651. So you can see that the king is actually made up of hundreds of people, and they make up the sovereign. And the sovereign has the sword, which represents the secular state, and he has the mitre, which represents the church. So all power is together. So referring to the Latin across the top from the book of Job, where it says, "There is no power on earth to be compared to him." And So that was the basis for the state. And so in the state, you can understand the power radiates from one point. All the people are there. And originally, the idea was it comes from the crown. Later on, of course, other writers like John Locke and the American Revolution and so on, the authority has to come from the people. So it goes back the other way. But either way, it's quite easy to think sort of conceptually. Because in the state, power is all radiating from or gravitating to a single point. So we now have the question of international politics. So it's a little bit less simple because we don't have a single Leviathan. So instead, we have anarchy. And so everyone is bumping off everybody else. Sorry, they're all ricocheting off everyone. It's a model which people refer to as consisting of states. They need survival, and they have to rely on self-help. So there's a good game theory example is the stag hunt. You know the stag hunt? That basically there's people have to rely on self-help, so it's extremely difficult to find ways that people can consistently cooperate. On the other hand, clearly they do cooperate at times. So it's not complete chaos like we see in Game of Thrones. It's not going to be sort of everyone bump off everybody else at the wedding type situation, or it's not going to look like Mad Max. It's anarchy, but clearly some kind of order can form, even when there's no central point. So yeah, so rather than anarchy meaning full Game of Thrones sort of mass sort of everyone killing everyone else sort of situation, it's more of a question. So in-house relations theorists call the anarchy problematic, which is that the existence of several states in anarchy renders the security of any one of them problematic. So we have to find ways of how do they find security when there's no central power. So, in the initial sort of way, sort of balance of power and alliances. So we assume that sort of some sort of stability will take place. And this was sort of very, this was well accepted in Europe in the 19th century. You can imagine if you're playing a game of diplomacy and so on, so everyone sort of forms alliances with everyone else. The only trouble is, of course, it didn't completely prevent war. So I quite like this picture of represent World War I. And sort of, in many ways, it sort of like highlights the way that World War I was not only a war, but also the destruction of kind of the everything people take for granted about European civilization. So sort of, even the horrors of sort of chemical warfare, which we just haven't seen in much Western countries since then. So probably international relations came into being after World War I as part of the quest of finding ways that we could prevent war. So one thing which people were looking for was a way that you could still understand the idea that power was dispersed, but power would be restrained in some way. But it's not restrained by higher law. There must be other ways that power is restrained, because recklessness in the use of power is clearly disastrous. So this short clip gives us an idea of where there's two conflicting views, which was very much sort of like the views that people had around World War I, about whether you could be an idealist, where you'd assume that everyone could agree on things simply through negotiation, or you believe purely in the use of power, in which case you sort of didn't really understand that there were any limits on the use of power. They're like two extremes in people's understanding of how international politics is going to work. So when they're saying sort of a mafia war has broken out, and Michael turns up, and the reason they look at him is because he's got a black eye, and somebody gets punched him. But he's talking to Sonny and Tom, that we saw before. But Sonny being quite aggressive, and Tom trying to get the people to negotiate.
What's with all the new faces? We'll need them now. After the hospital thing, Sonny got mad. We hit pretty much a 10-year 4 o'clock this morning. Jesus Christ. Looks like a fortress around here. 100 button men on the street 24 hours a day. That Turk shows one hair on his ass. He said, hey, Mike, come in. Let me look at you. You're beautiful. Beautiful. Just gorgeous. Hey, listen to this. The Turk wants to talk. That, you imagine the nerve on the son of a bitch, eh? Craps out last night, he wants to meet. What did he say? What did he say? The beat, that booth, he wants us to send Michael to hear the proposition. And the promise is that the deal is so good that we can't refuse. What about Bruno Tattaro? Part of the deal. Bruno can't figure out what he did to my father.
Sonny, we ought to hear what they have to say.
No more. Not this time, Consigliere. No more meetings, no more discussions, no more Salazzo trick. You give him one message, I want Salazzo. That's all I want. We go. I mean, you understand this bullshit? Hey, Salazzo, don't want to hear this. This is business, not personal. I shot my father. Even the city, your father was business, not personal.
Yeah, so there's sort of this clash of two views, which is a good way of sort of saying that people could be trying to be completely rational about it, but this hasn't prevented conflict. On the other hand, if people are so aggressive, this is also leading into disaster, which we see sort of, later in the film. So what it sort of raises is this question of hubris, which is in Thucydides, who was the chronicler of the Peloponnesian War, 5th century BC, which is kind of the basis for a lot of thinking about international relations. The Athenians were not the good guys at this stage. Possibly after about 80 years of warfare, it was the once great Athenian civilization had become militarized and corrupt. And they basically said to another city that because they were going to destroy another city. And the other city said, what about all the principles of Greek justice? And they said, well, the strong do what they will, the weak have to suffer what they must. And it was kind of, Thucydides really described this as this hubris which had overtaken the Athenians. And the definition of that is overweening arrogance, inviting nemesis, which later happened to the Athenians when they launched an invasion of Sicily, and they sent their fleets and their troops, and they all got sort of dragged into this sort of conflict in a faraway country, which they didn't really understand and had no infrastructure. Sounds nice.
Making reference to them?
Yeah, so the
No, I
Athenians,
was making reference to the fact that after they got their noses beaten once, they went in again.
So clearly, what Thucydides says and other writers say is that clearly might does not make right. That we have to have a standard of ethics, and as a starting point, the standard of ethics would be the value of the state, and it's to say that even if you're acting purely out of the interest of the survival of the state, you're at least measuring against one standard of ethics. So, in this film, in this clip a little bit later on, Michael meets Kay again after a long absence. And now he's part of the crime family. But he's explaining to Kay why he believes some of the things that happen are necessary.
I'm working for my father. He's sick. Very sick.
But you're not like him, Michael. I thought you were going to become a man like your father. You told me.
My father's no different than any other powerful man. Any man who's responsible for other people. Like a senator or a president.
You know how nice it sounds.
What?
Senators and presidents don't have men killed.
Who's being naive, Kenny?
So clearly there's a value being placed here that necessity has to be a basis for power. And it sort of then allows us to start to think about the fact that if power is to be effective, it has to be legitimate. So, and the idea of legitimacy then provides us with a guide to what our action would be. So, just this first.
Okay, my father's way of doing things is old. Finished. Even he knows that. I think in 5 years, the Corleone family is going to be completely legitimate.
So I quite like that small line, because even as this stage, the acting head of this crime family, he desperately seeks legitimacy, and he wants to get the family out of crime. Of course, we see him in the film and sequel, he's always dragged back in. It's kind of, it really becomes a tragedy in a true sense, that for all his efforts to become legitimate, he can never escape from this darkness, or this sort of moral, evil which has encompassed the family. But it still represents the fact that the craving for legitimacy is the basis for much power. So many people in IR will say that authority is legitimate power, because it's power which can be obeyed without having to use force all the time. It makes it far easier to have authority. It means that the costs of exercising power are much less. So it's many ways the basis that any sustainable or long-term power will be. And now we sort of have a little idea which is sort of allows us to see sort of a way that you might resolve that problem of anarchy. And that is, we remember our original diagram, all the circles are the same size. And that was kind of how people thought about things in the 19th century. But now there's more and more people in international relations who think maybe a hegemony, which is it's a Greek idea, and it's basically saying that, well, what if one of the states is sort of a bit bigger than the others, and it has quite a good deal of this authority? What if it starts to do things which are helpful to the other states, and want to have other states follow it? So, for example, they might provide a zone of security, or they might provide sort of stable rules in which trade and commerce can take place, or they may be sort of strong advocates for international norms. And international institutions, things like international law and so on. So people sort of follow their moral examples. So you can see this idea that having the hegemon there, the hegemon being the name for the state which exercises the hegemony, the hegemon is quite valuable. It provides this sort of a zone in which you're going to have much more security.
Is now an okay time for just a quick question? Yep. Does hegemony theories currently look at the idea that the hegemon will consider it in its interest to not act unless it absolutely has to? Because I know a lot of the origins of this was Sparta, and because the Spartan population was so small, they were constantly terrified about sending off soldiers. Is that still part of this theory?
Well, I think the way that people look at it now is that you're not going to be able to exercise the hegemony purely on the basis of force alone, like say it might have been in Greek times. It's going to have to be sort of the full range of international politics. So basically, you've got security, economics, laws and norms, and international regimes, and so on. But either way, what it means is that the hegemon there is starting to act a bit like a state. And so, partly to answer that question, a very well-known book on the subject is actually called Liberal Leviathan, about the United States, which has provided many of these sorts of benefits around the world, like security and a framework for trade and commerce and international laws and institutions, which means it's acting rather like the Leviathan originally did. So it's not completely Leviathan, because other states are still independent, but it's providing that it's doing the things which people wanted the state to do originally. And so that's the way that people are able to escape from the perils of anarchy through this idea of hegemony. So I think I have just one more clip, which is to sort of is a very nice one in which the various mafia families get together at the end of this mafia war to try to resolve the differences. And in many ways, it sort of like highlights the role the Corleone family played as the provider of what you call these public goods, sort of these benefits which allow the whole system to operate. And so you can see the role the Corleone family plays as the hegemon in this system. If you imagine that each of the mafia families is like an individual state, of course they are in a sense, because they don't obey the law. Each one is like a state, because there's no higher law.
Also, the other heads of the 5 families in New York, New Jersey, Carmine Cuneo from the Bronx, and Brooklyn stood the tide. And from Staten Island, we have with us Inspector Starkey and all the other associates that came from California, Kansas City, and all the other territories of the country. Thank you. I don't think they will get so far. I don't know. We're so unfortunate, so unnecessary. The day you lost a son, I lost a son. We're quick. And if the daddy agrees, then I'm willing to let things go on the way they were before.
We are all grateful to Don Corleone for calling this meeting. We all know him as a man of his word. A modest man, always listen to reason.
Yes, Monsignor. He's too modest. He had all the judges and politicians in his pocket. He refused to share them.
When did I ever refuse an accommodation? All of you know me here. When did I ever refuse? Except one time. And why? Because I believe this government is going to destroy us when he used to come. I mean, it's not like gambling or liquor or even women, but it's something that most people want nowadays, and it's forbidden to them by the person above you, the church. Even the police departments and help us in the past with gambling and other things are going to refuse to help us when it comes to narcotics. And I believe that then, and I believe that now.
Times have changed. Not like the old days, where we can do anything we want. A refusal is not the act of a friend. Don Corleone and all the judges and the politicians in New York, then he must share all he loves you. He must let us draw the water from the well. Certainly he can present a bill for such service. After all, we are not communists.
I also don't believe in drugs. For years I paid my people extra so they wouldn't do that kind of business. Somebody comes to them and says, I abolished. If you put up $3,000-$4,000 investment, we can make $50,000 distributing. So they can't resist. I want to control it as a business, to keep it respectable. I don't want it in schools. I don't want it sold to children. That's an infamy.
I hope that we could come here and reach it together. And as a reasonable man, I'm willing to do whatever's necessary to find a peaceful solution to this problem.
Then we are agreed. The traffic in drugs will be permitted with control, and Don Corleone will give it protection in the East, and there will be peace.
Yes, so that's sort of this fascinating study of the mafia family sort of carving up this drug trade, but also the way that the Corleone family was so strong that it had all these resources, like it had all the resources of government under its control. So it would then share them with the other mafia families. So it sort of provides a kind of dominance, but it's also a system where everyone could benefit from this hegemony which this one family has. So just a few final comments on international relations. So firstly, I think many people here would be interested just in the idea that international relations is trying to deal with these ideas in terms of theories. But the way that people are dealing with theories is the same as with crack theories in other social sciences or in sciences. So I had a lecturer who once presented these two slides, which are both paintings of the same place. But one of them is sort of in a realistic style. Another one is a sterner, kind of, I suppose, an impressionist sort of style. which one is right? There's no way you can say that one painting is the right painting. And it reflects the way that when we're trying to sort of think about things like international relations, we have to come up with theories. And theories, as one writer said, they should be understood as abstractions from a complex reality and attempt to provide generalizations about the phenomena of the study. So that you might have one theory which is extremely detailed, but may not provide you with much broad predictive power. Another theory which is sort of very broad brush and tries to abstract out a lot of details that may provide you with stronger predictive power. So some of the sorts of ideas which I've presented earlier, they boil down the international system to just a few sort of circles on a black sort of space. That's sort of being very abstract. And more people try to introduce more details. But it just sort of revives the idea that there's always going to be debate about how we actually try and create these theories. Either way, just to sort of semi-finish up, a lot of what I've been saying then boils down into these conventional international relations theories. So I thought I'd just present it at the end rather than the start. If you present it at the start, I think it's a bit dull. I think it's good to see some examples. And then sort of see at the end, well, you might sort of see by example what these are. So realists are really focused on the state. And they tend to be preoccupied by the continued recurrence of conflict. And so they think about power in states. And then liberals are always wondering, well, we do have conflict. And then again, we also have quite a lot of cooperation. In fact, probably have cooperation more often than we have conflict. But why is this possible? And so they're thinking about the fact that there are international institutions which make this possible. Then the constructivists, that's a very fashionable field in academia, but it can really mean a great many things, although the basic idea is that many of our understandings of what other things are in international relations have been formed through our social interaction with others. So, for example, if realists say a state should always be on its guard for its security against other states, the constructivists say, oh, it only thinks that because of the social interaction it's had with other states. So things could therefore change, because realists don't really have a theory of change, but constructivists are thinking about how things change. On the other hand, they're less good at predicting the future. They also feel that the power of ideas actually makes a difference to things rather than just material things like states or military forces or economic wealth and so on. And just study finally, we said the hegemon, and so it's the map of the Pacific with United States forces spread across the entire country. To give us an idea of, this is the idea of a regional hegemon. So it sort of brings us right up to sort of the present day and sort of the current context and the debates we might have. And then you have all these sort of new debates about you have the hegemon, and then you have the hegemonic challenger. And these sorts of things then open up a whole new field for debates. So, any questions?
Given that, as you said, there's a very heavy basis in a lot of international relations theory on Thucydides, how often is that actually tied to classical studies in an explicit way? For example, the quote you put up about the strong do what they will and the weak do as they must. Part of the context for that dialogue is that if you read through the whole Peloponnesian War, every state, when it's being attacked, says, no, the borders of states are sacred, we must absolutely not violate them. Then the moment everyone else is not looking, they invade their neighbours. Mm-hmm. And you get this cycle, and it looks like it links to a lot of very complex ideas around exactly what is a house and what is a home, and what is the importance of the inviolability of individual property. How much of that gets explored in IR at an explicit level?
Yeah, it depends on whether people in IR are sort of borrowing from these canonical texts or really sort of being, I suppose, classical scholars in their own right. Well, there has been some recent, quite interesting sort of overlap. A writer called Richard S. Leboeuf has written what he called a cultural theory of international relations, which is really sort of going back on a lot of classical studies about honour and prestige and other sorts of issues from the classics, and sort of trying to bring that back to the fore. So I think that you do find that while sort of canonical texts are generally sort of handed down, they generally sort of become used as sort of more like sort of teaching examples to illustrate sort of wider points more in the international relations rather than the classics officially. We are often seeing quite interesting sort of returns to the classics and people dipping back in and sort of really sort of looking at new ways of looking at the classics from this perspective.
The clip you showed from The Godfather where everyone is around the table discussing the end to the mafia conflict touches briefly on the fact that multiple people had lost family members and things like that, and the implication is that the conflict had been needless and largely destructive for everyone involved. When you expand this to an international relations sense, realists will often argue that there is often benefit to conflict, and I think for at least one side in a conflict where there's a decisive victor, that can be the case. However, with the 20th century and the development of nuclear weapons, the idea that a conflict can now not only leave everyone slightly worse off, but actually leave everyone completely out of the game and or dead. Do you think realist theory is challenged by the concept of a nuclear, or a concept of a kind of conflict that, if eventuated, would completely destroy humanity?
Yeah, I think that's the point which you touched on there is that there's often sort of a notion of realism, which is sort of Game of Thrones realism, which I've sort of been trying to emphasize is something which people have been furiously moving away from. And I mean, basically, since World War I. I mean, it's hard to think of anyone since World War I who ever thought that war was a good thing. And realists are anxious about the recurrence of war, but they're often what they're searching for is ways of preventing it. So this was only sort of intensified with the perils of nuclear war, because what realists are worried about is that irrational decisions are made, or they're concerned about the fact that as in World War I, where you could have had a number of countries that didn't want war, yet they were all into it, which they were all sort of drawn into it. And so what realists are worried about is why war recurs, even in situations people didn't actually want one. So I think that's the emphasis which people have. And I think a lot about the study of conflicts has changed a lot with nuclear as well, because you're not simply talking about people declaring war on each other. Conflicts tend to be sort of much more complex in the way they develop.
Well, on the concept of honour in particular, the same with a lot of these concepts, we're kind of borrowing from an ancient society that had very, very different perspectives to ours, and kind of trying to apply them, I'm assuming on most of the time, a worldwide scale. How applicable is this, given kind of differences, vast differences we have between cultures and these kind of concepts?
Well, that's the book which I mentioned, which I found to be quite interesting to read, yet I'm uncertain as to whether it provides very sound predictive power at a political science level, which is a way of saying that it's interesting to look at sort of honour and pride in the past, whether it applies now is another story. Although, of course, you could get me going on the subject for my PhD research, which is the struggle for status in international relations, where numerous debates take place about whether research in psychology is relevant to international relations. So things like the fact that in psychological experiments, people will often refuse bargains where they feel that they're being unfairly treated, even though it may be a bargain where they're technically better off than having nothing at all. So if, say, $100 is split, $99 for me and $1 for you, you're still $1 better off. But most people offer such an unfair bargain will tend to refuse it. And so the question which comes in from the psychological side is whether this is sort of enduring aspects of human nature, and whether human nature is always sort of sought a sort of a sense of respect or a sense of honour or a sense of justice or something like that, and therefore that is always going to apply to international politics as well.
You don't go with the deceptive thing of that. Instead of saying we have $100 to split, you could just go with, do you want $1?
Yes, we'd be much more alone. But yeah, so the question is, whether sort of a search for some kind of honour or status has always been a sort of a third element of conflict. So you have sort of, survival or self-defense is one reason. Sort of economic prosperity or wealth is another reason. And then sort of your pride and status is a third reason for conflict. But whether that really is realistic. Because, what I'd say is that if people are so concerned about their pride and honour, they should say, oh, that causes conflict. And why is it that we also have peace? So the problem is that it can't explain why we have war and peace. So that's just...
If people are starting to look at issues around nuclear weapons and the idea that no one wants war, is there then a sense to which international relations is heading almost back to statesmanship from the 19th century view, where people look at limited gains? The scene Mark mentioned, in the lead up to that scene, before the negotiations, it's very clear the Corleones have gained. You wouldn't necessarily say they've won outright, but the Italian family is still very strong, but the Corleones have gained. They've cemented their power, and in ways that's expanded their power, so they have at least had limited gains. And that meeting in context looks like it's people saying, right, we've had things shift, now we'd like to stop things, because if it goes any longer, it'll get really, really nasty. And that, as I understood it, was a large part of the dynamic through the 19th century. There was war, and then the war stopped, and at the negotiations, if you'd won, you got a little bit, and the other person lost a little bit, but you still both kept existing.
So there's two answers in that, out of probably countless answers possible. One is that there's a really good current in international relations called the English School of International Relations, which was led by Professor Hedley Bull, and one of the academics later went over to the UK and named the building over on our campus. And they also say that the international society was quite an important concept, and so that's why people couldn't go too far in wars, because you didn't want to disrupt the entirety of the international society. You could have wars within the structure, but you didn't want to overthrow the entire structure. The structure was so valuable as providing, again, a form of framework for stability. The other aspect of looking at that is there's a very good book called War and Change in International Politics by Robert Gilpin, where he has nice graphs and things where he talks about how the state can kind of expand its power while it's relatively cheap to do so, but the costs keep rising, so it's sort of like you have a curve going up. And so when sort of you reach a point where the costs of expansion outweigh the benefits of expansion, and then other people sort of expand in the contrary direction while it's relatively inexpensive for them to expand. So you can see this idea that there's sort of a continual cost-benefit curve to sort of expansion and contraction of the power of states. It's quite interesting. Anyone from this side? Now, you've been reading about international relations from Zambia.
Yes, I have.
Is there an undead angle?
Indeed.
Questions?
Did you do stuff up in the Hidden Bull or in the main campus? Or, sorry, I'm just...
Well, I'm based over in the International Relations Department in the Hidden Bull Centre.
Just a question about the about the return to statesmanship, where you could just make a little game to the point. In a state of MAD, you can't ever actually win, because if it looks like the other guy can't win, they have nothing to do but to launch the nukes.
Lose.
You can lose, yeah, but like you got nothing to
The
lose.
other guy can try to avoid losing by just letting you make marginal gains.
Exactly, that's my point. So all you can do is you can't ever get a comprehensive victory. All you can do is just get little bits of the state.
But what you tended to have in the Cold War was that the discipline of international relations focused on that question in terms of sort of, you had the big theories like realism, liberalism, which were sort of your overarching views of the whole world. But then you had sort of what they call middle level theorizing, which is sort of operational theories, and there'd be things like the theory of deterrence, and you have everything which involves just the specifics of deterrence. And this was all involved in ways of trying to both prevent a nuclear war and also try to work out why one might inadvertently take place. So you could try to prevent that as well. But of course, the Cold War also had numerous conflicts in sort of third world countries and so on, which was ways that the superpowers could exercise their rivalry without resorting to any risk of nuclear war. So, so you can see how politics kept going, but they kept the nuclear arsenal truly secure. Well, thank you very much for your.
Thank you.